Hi, my name's Kurt Smith, and I'm the co-author of this brand new book, The Gospel Heritage of Georgia Baptists. In this particular video, I want to delve a little bit into the first chapter of this book, chapter that I wrote. In fact, the first three chapters are my contribution to the book. All three are biographical. They focus on the three principal leaders of the first generation of Georgia Baptists. Those leaders are Daniel Marshall, his son Abraham Marshall, and Jesse Mercer. In studying the history of these three men, and especially Daniel Marshall, his significance being that when he came into Georgia in 1771, the following year he established what has been called the very first continuing Baptist church in Georgia, Keokee Baptist Church. In recent years, there have been some leaders in the Georgia Baptist Convention who have revised some historical facts about Daniel Marshall and even his son Abraham, and trying to say that those men and their generation were really Anabaptist, that their beliefs, their practice, but their identity were Anabaptist. But the facts of history say something very different, and that is certainly something that myself and my co-author Brandon Smith set out to prove, and we believe that we have succeeded in proving that, because what we have dealt with in our chapters have been primary source materials, primary documents that show emphatically that these men confessionally, doctrinally, were certainly not Anabaptists. It is true that Daniel Marshall was accused in a derogatory way of being an Anabaptist by the Anglican Church that was here in Georgia when he entered into Georgia in those early 1770s. It was before the American Revolution. Georgia was still a British colony, and so the religion, the Protestant religion at that time that dominated Georgia was, of course, the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And the Anglican bishop who basically prosecuted Marshall when he first came into Georgia, he actually wrote about Marshall being what he called an Anabaptist, but that was not an identification that Daniel Marshall himself ever identified himself with personally. Those were not in his words. That was in the words of someone that was very much anti-Baptist and did not believe at all in Marshall's convictions, and certainly did not want Daniel Marshall pioneering Baptist churches in Georgia. Well, another matter and another fact that is brought out about Daniel Marshall, and is certainly one of the primary focuses of our book as a whole, is that this first generation of Georgia Baptists, confessionally, what they really were evangelical Calvinists. And this is a fact. This is not hearsay. This is not an idea that my co-author and I have come up with. It's not speculation. Again, it comes from primary source materials. It's very clear. Well, in the first chapter on Daniel Marshall, there's a section in this chapter where I tell the story of how Daniel Marshall and his brother-in-law Shubal Stearns were actually examined by a man representing the Philadelphia Association when they were there in Winchester, Virginia. And the reason they were examined was because there were some members of this particular Baptist church where Marshall and his brother-in-law had become members, and they were really upset with Daniel Marshall in particular. They were not in agreement with his enthusiastic preaching. And so the Philadelphia Association, they were called upon by this church. The church was a part of that association, and this church in Winchester, Virginia, they wanted the Philadelphia Association to send a man who would put Daniel Marshall and Shubal Stearns under examination, examining their theology as well as examining their ministry and practice. And so in the first chapter, and on page 17, I tell about this particular event. And what's so important about this is what comes out of this examination proves that Daniel Marshall was in fact an evangelical Calvinist. It says, responding to the complaint, that is the complaint that was made by the Baptist Church in Winchester, Virginia, the association, the Philadelphia Association, sent a pastor by the name of Benjamin Miller to conduct an examination of Marshall. Miller's probe would be a thorough search into both the character and theology of Marshall. In addition to this, his investigation would also include Shubal Stearns, who was Marshall's brother-in-law, and at this time had joined Marshall in his evangelistic efforts. Since they were therefore a ministry team, if you will, Pastor Miller considered it a priority to probe both of these men together. The significance of this inquiry is that it would prove these men were not only Baptists, but they were thoroughgoing Calvinists as well. You see, in 1752, the Philadelphia Association raised a question concerning all the churches and their connections. And this is coming from the primary source material. Philadelphia Association stated, whether a person denying unconditional election, the doctrine of original sin, and the final perseverance of the saints, and striving to effect as many as he can, may have full communion with the church. Now that was the question that was brought to the Philadelphia Association. The unanimous answer, which returned to the assembly, stated that whoever harbored such ideas that were contradicting, quote, the absolute sovereignty of God over his creatures, could not be allowed as true members of our churches. And to be even more specific, the association made it clear that anyone who preaches against the confession of faith and catechism would be denied membership in the churches. So in 1754, when Pastor Miller was scrutinizing Marshall and Stearns, he would have been doing so under this commission given by the association in 1752. And then here's a question that I raise. What was the final result of this examination? What did Benjamin Miller discover theologically about Daniel Marshall and Shubal Stearns? Benjamin Miller reported, quote, that if he had such warm-hearted Christians in his church, like Marshall and Stearns, he would not take gold for them. He therefore charged those who had complained against them to rather nourish such gifts given to the church as opposed to disdaining them. Now, commenting on how important this event was for Marshall and Stearns, Dr. Tom Nettles, in his biographical sketch of Daniel Marshall, made these insightful conclusions. And this is really important. Listen to what Dr. Nettles wrote. He said, first, their giftedness in proclamation and teaching appeared adequate in content and edifying in effect. Second, their spirit, though exuberant, they were very passionate in their preaching, did not come under censure as arrogant, prideful, or improperly enthusiastic, but as warmly spiritual. Dr. Nettles observed, the regular Baptists of the Philadelphia Association had experienced their share of overwhelming conviction and knew that both despair and joy can periodically overwhelm and alter physical strength. The warmth of the exercises was a delight, not an offense. Finally, their theology supported the strength of the exercise. Concerning this matter, Dr. Nettles made these careful observations. Benjamin Miller fully embraced the judgment of the Philadelphia Association that it cannot allow that any are true members of our churches who deny the said principles of total depravity, unconditional election, effectual calling, and the certain perseverance of God's elect. Had the theology been error cloaked in zeal, he would never have admonished the petitioners to nourish rather than complain of such gifts. So, here's my conclusion. We can rightly deduce from Miller's examination that Daniel Marshall was a sound evangelical, a convinced Baptist, and a staunch Calvinist. Furthermore, he was a man who had been awakened with a holy fire to spread the gospel of Christ to as many as he could reach. He was thus a true missionary at heart. So, based on this one example, and there are plenty of other examples that are given in this first chapter, as there are in the other two biographical sketches as well of Abraham Marshall and Jesse Mercer. These men were indeed thoroughgoing Calvinists. They were not Anabaptists. They were not Arminian. They were not semi-Pelagian. They were nothing of the sort. They were evangelical Calvinists, confessionally, doctrinally. And what's even more important than that is to understand and to see that they put their theology into practice. They were not what one brother would say that we should never be, and that is armchair Calvinists. They were experiential Calvinists. They put their theology into practice. And what did the theology of historic evangelical Calvinism, what did it produce in Daniel Marshall? It produced a man of God who became one of the greatest Baptist pioneer missionaries in the late 18th century and early 19th century here in the state of Georgia, and then of course in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. So this is just a sampling of what you will find in this book, The Gospel Heritage of Georgia Baptists. And I certainly encourage you, especially my fellow Baptist pastors in the state of Georgia, get this book, read it, understand the history, understand the heritage, understand where we have come from, and be encouraged by it, but also be challenged by it. May we all grow from the lessons that we can learn and glean from these men of God who have blazed such a worthy trail for us to follow. Thank you.